I'm Logan. I'm a recent Oxford PPE graduate and tutor at the Oxbridge Group, and today I'm going to talk you through a mock PPE interview question. So before I get started, just some things to keep in mind. When you actually interview for PPE at Oxford, you'll have at least 3 interviews, one each for politics, philosophy, and economics. This question is skewed towards politics, but obviously involves a lot of elements of all 3 subjects and highlights the connections between them. And like most PPE interview questions, there's plenty of literature or theory that you could draw on to support either position in answering this, but at the end of the day, the question is super subjective and the interviewers are way more interested in how you think than in your answer per se. I know people say this a lot, but it's really, really true, especially for PPE, since it doesn't require or assume that you've studied any of the 3 subjects before. That said, though, it's still important to take a stance one way or the other, even if your yes or no is qualified. And also, because the question is so subjective and your follow-up questions will be based on your initial response, your interview could end up taking a very different path from mine. But I've tried to outline 2 of what I think are some of the most likely or obvious initial responses and then possible follow-up questions from there. So after each question or follow-up, feel free to pause and try to think through it on your own before listening to my hints. And similarly, in the real interview, feel free to take a moment to collect your thoughts before you respond. Good luck and enjoy. So our first question is, did Robin Hood have a net positive effect on his society? And why or why not? Take a minute. Okay, so the basic concept, if you're not familiar with it, is that Robin Hood stole from the rich and gave to the poor. So the kind of most obvious concepts being discussed here are redistribution on the one hand and stealing or law and order on the other hand. So 2 very likely kind of starting points for your answer would be either yes, Robin Hood had a net positive effect because he promoted redistribution, which is good for society or social welfare, or no, Robin Hood did not have a positive effect, yet had a net negative effect because he stole or broke the law, which hurts society. So we're going to start by talking through some follow-ups if your initial response was that Robin Hood did have a net positive effect. The first follow-up, if you had responded that Robin Hood had a net positive effect because he affected redistribution, would be, why is redistribution good? So take a minute to think about that and then we'll talk through it. Okay, so a pretty common kind of instinctive response to this, without knowing any specific theories or authors or anything, is that redistribution is good because it increases equality. And a lot of people's kind of gut intuitive moral views incorporate at least some degree of egalitarianism. So a lot of people think that more equality, all else equal, is better, morally better, or desirable. One kind of possible justification for this from a more philosophical standpoint is that people all have the same inherent worth or value, so they should be able to live their lives and enjoy the freedoms enabled by wealth to the same extent. And then another possible way to think about this that's a bit more economic or technical is that all else equal, increasing equality increases social welfare under most social welfare functions. So obviously, according to an egalitarian welfare function, social welfare function, welfare would be improved by redistribution. Under a Rawlsian welfare function, if Robin Hood gave to the worst off, which is a pretty likely bet, then total social welfare would be improved. And even under utilitarian welfare function, which is not generally seen as being super concerned with equality. Robin Hood's redistribution could increase total social welfare because of the decreasing marginal utility of money or wealth. Obviously, there are also lots of other possible explanations of redistributive preferences, but these are kind of some of the most intuitive and obvious, and also some of the most relevant given the circumstances. There are plenty of other views of how redistributive preferences that are harder to evaluate in this case because we don't, have all of the information about how systematically Robin Hood is redistributing. And to that point, it's important here to make sure that even if you know kind of other theories that are related, that you're answering the specific question, not just trying to show, how much of the literature you know. Okay, so for our next follow-up question, if you had said something along the lines of what I talked about there, my next follow-up question would be that all else equal, a very common assumption underlying a lot of economics, almost never holds in practice. So in reality, increasing equality often decreases total wealth and thus may decrease social welfare. Why might this occur, either in general or in the Robin Hood case, and how would that affect your argument? Okay, so you don't need to know this, author or theory at all, but you probably can intuitively understand or think through a lot of these concepts either way. So the classic metaphor for the inefficiency produced by redistribution is Oken's leaky bucket. And he and other authors highlight kind of three main reasons why taking, say, $1,000 from the rich does not necessarily, and redistributing it doesn't necessarily mean that the poor will get $1,000, or that, and more generally, why some of the surplus or, wealth or welfare is lost in transit when redistribution occurs. So the first effect here is kind of a category of substitution or incentive effects, which would be something along the lines of the rich people in Robin Hood's story have less incentive to work because if their wealth is just going to be taken, then they don't benefit as much from working to make more money. So this might decrease the total amount of hours worked in the economy, which would then decrease its overall output. The next category of income or wealth effects is that the rich would have less excess income to save or invest, since Robin Hood's taking it, which would decrease investment and then eventually decrease growth. Because the poor people who Robin Hood's giving the money to are, more likely to be using the income to just survive and consume rather than save or invest. And then the third category would be the administrative or bureaucratic costs, which would be the costs of collecting or distributing transfers, both in general and in Robin Hood's case. So all of these could apply to Robin Hood to varying degrees depending on kind of how he structures his stealing. So if Robin Hood acts more like a roving bandit, if you're familiar with the concept or with Olson's work, and kind of steals randomly and unsystematically, he will probably cause worse substitution and income effects. People won't want to work to get rich or save or invest their riches, because if they do, Robin Hood might just steal them, and they have kind of no way of knowing what they'll actually be able to keep for themselves or benefit from. Also, it's probably pretty safe to assume that Robin Hood took some of the wealth that he was transferring for himself, at least, to survive on, since he, couldn't be working holding down a 9 to 5 while he was busy stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, but also potentially taking, more than what he needed to survive on as kind of a corruption rent. However, if Robin Hood is less corrupt, then those administrative or bureaucratic costs may be lower. And if he kind of takes a more long-term perspective of, his end goal being increasing equality, which we think it is, then he might pillage in a way that creates a smaller leak. So this would look more like taxation than like a roving bandit. And there's, good reason to think that that would be the case, because Robin Hood is thought to care about his society's welfare. Also, other than super hardcore utilitarians, most people do think that redistribution is justified, even if there's some amount of leakage. So given that, and that Robin Hood it's pretty likely that he's thieving in a way that creates a relatively small leak, and that his society probably doesn't have much formal redistribution via taxation occurring, then there's a strong case that Robin Hood's redistribution still has a positive effect overall. Okay, that was a lot. Now we're going to move on to the next follow-up. If you had answered something along those lines, or really any answer where you started by saying, yes, he has a net positive effect, then this is where we would go next. Okay, so I agree that more equality is better, and that Robin Hood's redistribution helps society by increasing equality. But what about the negative effects of his stealing? How can you say or know that the positive outweighs the negative? Okay, to answer this, I would start by thinking about why we think that stealing is bad in the first place. So you could go down a kind of law-based path, that stealing is wrong because it is against the law. To me, probably a more convincing or intuitive argument would be that it's wrong because it violates property rights, which a lot of people see as, central to kind of social order, and potentially as more fundamental than a normative goal like equality. So there are 3 common types of arguments for rights that I would potentially think about here, or that someone could use to respond to this question. The first would be a libertarian view, which is basically that rights protect citizens from state infringement. So the benefits in the long term outweigh any potential inefficiency or loss of welfare. A pluralistic view would kind of take a broader perspective, thinking about other aspects of society, not just the economy, and arguing that rights are important because they protect against the kind of domination of the market economy that would happen if there were no rights and if anything could be bought and sold in a free market. And then a humanistic kind of Rawlsian view might be that rights are important because they recognize kind of everyone's basic equal human dignity and provide a guarantee of mutual equal fairness or respect. So according to these views, any of these views, you could argue that rights are universal principles that trump equality or efficiency gains. And so, no matter how much, equality or even efficiency was gained by Robin Hood stealing, it would still have a net negative effect because it violates people's fundamental rights. However, one possible counterargument to this would be that any of these perspectives or arguments require rights to be universal and equal and unconditional. However, given the context of Robin Hood and his story, he was probably operating in quite an undemocratic society with very unequal rights and high encroachment upon those rights by the state or other agents. And so his society was probably pretty far from the ideals that these views are based on. That said, given that the rich who Robin Hood's stealing from were probably benefiting from the state infringement on the poor's rights, if not infringing on the poor's rights themselves, Robin Hood stealing is more easily justified or outweighed by its positive effects. Okay, just to wrap up, as I said, that's just one way that you could have answered these questions. You could obviously approach it from a lot of different angles or theoretical viewpoints, and the following up questions would change accordingly. So just to return to those kind of two possible first answers I gave, if you had initially responded that Robin Hood had a net negative effect because his stealing was wrong, I probably would have asked similar follow-ups, but basically reversed the order and started with more questions about why stealing is bad, depending on, what type of direction your initial response went in, and then later asking you about his positive impact and pushing you to explain why the negative outweighs the positive. But either way, regardless of whether your answers were the same as mine, I hope this gives you a sense for what an Oxford PPE or politics interview is like, and thank you for watching.